Welcome back to another video, and by the end of today's video we're going to actually reuse the resources, and it's going to tell us what resources we need at the top right of our screen whenever we look at a specific buildable, and once we use them you will see that they are getting updated automatically. So let's get started. So the first thing would be to actually provide the information for every single one of our buildables, what kind of resources they actually require in order to be finished. So for that, we need to go to our buildings folder and we need to open up our buildable structure. And inside of here, previously we added a variable called resources, which was just a single integer. Now we're going to add a different variable and we're going to call this items. And in my situation, I'm using the slots structure for this. So these are my items. So if you're using a different inventory system, make sure that you make this into your items type and make this into an array of them, because, well, you are going to provide multiple different items probably in order for this build to be finalized. And so I'm going to add that one. And now I can go to my, not the component, but the database. And inside of the database, I'm going to add those items. So for the foundation, I'm just going to go ahead and select a log. And I'm going to say I need like 4 logs in order to finish this. Now, I did basically the same thing for every single one of my buildables, except for the doors will require 2 logs, and the window is going to require to have 2 logs and 2 planks. Obviously, it should have been glass, but I don't have a glass item in here, but I do have logs and planks, so I'm going to use those. Now, the next one is going to be setting up so that, well, we can actually see what resources we actually need when we look at a specific buildable. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is go ahead and create myself a new widget, which is going to contain all these items. So I'm going to call this UI build resources. Let's open this one up. And simply what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the canvas panel with a vertical box. And that's basically it. Let's make this into a variable. Let's make our box into a variable so that we can actually populate this with the items. So now in the graph, this is going to be quite simple. All we're going to have is a variable, which is going to be called buildable. We're going to have buildable. This is going to be instance editable exposed on spawn. And this is going to have our buildables structure on it. There we go. Now let's bring it in. Let's break it so that we get its parameters, all the good stuff. And from here, what I'm going to do is from the items, I'm going to do a loop for each. So we're going to go through all the items that are necessary for this thing to be finished. And inside of here, then we can go ahead and we can create a widget. And this widget is going to be like the item that's going to be necessary. So basically the visual representation of it. I'm going to keep this very simple, and I'm going to use the same icon as I use for my items, which is the UI item data. Now in my situation in this inventory, it requires me to have a lot of data with it. It asks for the index, inventory, widget, source, and the player. I'm not going to fill out any of that. All I'm going to provide is the item, because I'm not supposed to drag from this. I'm not supposed to use this. This is just a visual representation. So the item information is enough. Now I'm going to bring in the vertical box next so that we can actually populate this with all these widgets. So I'm going to go ahead and add a child to a vertical box. And then let's connect the return value to the content. So now this is supposed to populate this widget with all the items that are necessary. Now we're going to need to refresh this, restore the values, because we're going to use some buildables and there's going to be less of them. So I'm going to go ahead and create us a custom event, which I'm going to call simply refresh. So this is going to clear this vertical box and repopulate this. So I'm going to drag in this vertical box and I'm going to drag from it, and let's say clear children. And this is going to remove all those widgets that we have created over here. And then we can go ahead and proceed with the loop so that it regenerates what's left. There we go. So now the next thing that I want to do is create a space for this in my HUD. So I'm going to open up my UI HUD and I'm going to add a border. Border should do the trick. And this border right here, I'm going to go ahead and anchor this to the whole right side of the screen. Set the offset to 0. size to like 300, and position is going to be minus 300 on this one. And also I'm going to change the brush color to have no alpha so that it would be transparent. There we go. So this is going to fill up from the top and it's going to go down. In my situation, obviously you can have any setup you want. Now, one thing that is important is that we rename this so that it is easier to access. So I'm going to call this build resources, and I'm going to make this into a variable so that we can access this from the outside as well. There we go. Now, last setup that we need for the widgets is to actually store the HUDs variable inside of our character so we can actually access this. So inside of our third-person character, on begin play, we have this create HUD. So I'm going to go ahead and promote our HUD to a variable, and I'm going to call this UI HUD variable, like so. And then I'm going to connect this like so, connect this with the executions. There we go. That's it. So now we have access to our HUD, and when we drag from our HUD, we can go ahead and talk with all of its variables. Now, the next thing would be to ask the buildable what kind of resources it actually still needs. And for that, inside of our buildables folder, inside of our building folder, we have the build interface, which is getting used in all of our buildables. And for this, inside of here, we're going to add ourselves a new function, which we're going to call return buildable data. And this is going to have a single output, and this is going to be our buildable data, and this type is as buildables, this guy right here. Compile and save that. There we go. Now we actually need to pass this value so that it does return something. So we can close our interface and go to our buildables. I'm going to open up my build master, and inside of here now in the interfaces we should have the return buildable data, and I'm going to drag my buildable variable and plug that in. Now I have one more location where I need to do this, and that is in my build window, because this does not use the buildable master, well, the build master. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing over here as well. There we go. So that's good. Now the next part would be to actually go ahead and ask for this information and set up all that stuff. So for this, I'm going to create us a new function, which is going to be like a non-stop trace, which is going to do the line trace constantly, and it's going to interact with the objects that it hits so that it would actually be able to return this information to us. So I'm going to call this non-stop trace. And inside of this project right here, in the building one, we did previously create this trace function, which all it does is just a regular line trace by channel, and it returns the hit actor. That's all it does. So in the non-stop trace, we're going to go ahead and launch that one. And from here, we're going to do does implement interface, and we're going to check if this thing that we are looking at has the build interface. So we're going to do an if branch check on that one, see if that is true, and if it has the buildables interface, well, then we can proceed with the code, see what's up with it, and all that good stuff. Just to make my life a little bit easier when it comes to routing, I'm going to promote this to a local variable, so our hit actor. So I'm going to call this local actor, like so. That's going to make my life quite a bit easier. So also I'm just going to go ahead and plug this local inside of here as well. Now, if this actor that we have hit doesn't have the buildables interface, well, we don't really want to do anything other than we will want to remove the information about the resources that are needed if that thing is available on our screen. But if it's true, if we have hit our buildable, we don't want to display anything if it's already a finished build. So what I'm going to do is grab our actor that we have hit, and from this we are going to try to say is build finished message. So from true, we're going to run that thing. So now it's going to tell us whether the build has been finished. So we can do an if on that one, because if the build has been finished, well, again, we don't want to do anything. We maybe just want to remove the widget if it's visible, but if it's false, then we want to do something with it. And what we want to do with it, if it's not finished, we want to go ahead and return build data, because we want to know what resources we actually need for this one. So let's plug in our local actor as well. and something like this. So now we need to start to create, well, display and hide the necessary resources widget. So for that, let's go ahead and let's create it first. So back in the event graph on begin play, what I'm going to do is simply create that widget and store it in the memory. So we're going to go ahead and create a widget, and the widget is going to be our build resources. We're going to leave the inputs empty. We're just simply going to promote this to a variable, and I'm going to call this resource widget. There we go. And that's it for now. For now, that's going to be it. While we are over here, let's go ahead and let's launch our nonstop trace as well, so that we don't forget to do that later. So we're going to do set timer by function name, so that it constantly runs this function for us, and this function is our nonstop trace. So let's go ahead and let's type its name inside of here. So nonstop trace. Now the time I'm going to do 0.1 seconds should be good enough, and I'm going to make this into a looping event so it never stops and keeps on going constantly and reports us about any changes. Now back in our nonstop trace, let's fill out these empty branch pins right here. So from this one, from the false, we're going to go ahead and grab our resource widget. And from this, we're going to check is visible. We're going to check if this widget right here is visible. So we're going to do an if on this one and connect it to false. Now, if this widget is visible and whatever we have hit does not have the build interface, obviously we do not want it to be shown no longer. So what I'm going to do is drag this in, build resources, and I'm going to remove from parent. So on true, we are removing this from our screen so that it would no longer be displayed. Now I'm going to copy these exact same nodes, or one more thing that we could do is actually move these to over here and connect this true route as well. So you can copy and paste this once more, or have two of those things like I have. We'll have one thing that connects both of these routes to over here like I have. There we go. Now, if this is false, we don't want to do anything because it's already fine. This thing is not visible and it's already hidden, so everything is all good. Now, let's proceed with this thing. So if we have hit the buildable and the build is not yet finished, we have asked for its data, and now we need to go ahead and show that. So I'm going to go ahead, grab our UI HUD. And from this, I'm going to get the build resources border. So this guy right here. And from this, we can go ahead and add a child to this. So just add child. Now, the child of this is the resource widget. So we want to go ahead and grab that one and plug that into the content. So now this is going to move our resource widget inside of our HUD and display this on the right side of our screens. So let's bring it back a little bit, because before that we got to make sure some of the other things are okay. So with that, what I mean by that is from our resource widget, we want to get that. We want to get is visible, because we want to know whether that thing is already visible or not. So we're going to do an if to check if it's visible. Now, if it's not visible, then we are adding this child. Otherwise, if it already is visible, we don't want to add a child because we have already added it when it was not visible. Now it is visible, it's added. So what we want to do is refresh this thing. So I'm going to go ahead and get our resource widget, and I'm going to run a refresh function from over here, like so. Now, but before we can do this, we got to make sure that we do one more thing, which is actually tell it what it needs to display. So the buildable, this build data. So I'm going to, again, from the resource widget, I'm going to go ahead and set the buildable, this guy right here. And let's plug that in to the execution route and connect the interface output like so. So now it's going to inform whatever it is, and it's going to go ahead and create it or refresh it depending on if it's already on the screen or if it's not yet been added to our screens. So this whole thing should look something like this. So let's hope for the best and let's hope it works. Now, let's see. let's maybe give it a try and see what happens. So let's press B, build something. There we go. So we have 4 logs. It wants to add multiple since it hasn't yet. Oh, because it adds first and it refreshes later. So let's go ahead and let's fix that. So after we add a child, we also want to refresh that. So we can actually go to over here. We can do something like this. So we're going to add a child and instantly refresh it so that it wouldn't create us multiple instances. Otherwise, we need to wait for 0.1 second for it to be refreshed. See, 2 logs, 2 planks, 4 logs, and it updates pretty much instantly. Obviously, if you wanted the update to be a little bit quicker, because it takes 0.1 second, you can always go ahead and bump up in the timer the time that it takes for this function to be launched. I think 0.1 is good enough. Now, the next thing that I want to set up is actually using, removing the resources necessary. So my system for this inventory is that I have a inventory that is with the player constantly, and also I have a backpack component as well. So my situation is going to be a little bit more complex. So I'm going to add a new function. I'm going to call this, let's call this use build resource. And inside of here, what I'm going to do is, let's see. So first we need the information about what resources we actually need. So over here, I'm going to add as a new input, and I'm going to call this actor. And this is going to be just a regular actor. And from here, we are going to go ahead and return a build a data message so that we get the updated information about the resources that are necessary. So from here, we're going to break this, and it's going to return us the items. So we're going to go ahead and loop through all of those items that we have over there. Now, after this, what I'm going to do is, since like I said, I have multiple inventories, so I have 2 that I need to check for. I'm going to go ahead, grab the inventory component first, and I'm going to go ahead and run a function that I have in here, which is called return items. So this, what it's going to do essentially is it's going to go through the whole component and it's going to check for an item. Now the source I need to provide is a player. That's what I need to do because that's going to get returned over here. So I know that that is coming from the player, and it's easier for me to remove the item later. But in this situation, it's not going to matter too much. The next, I want to check if the total amount is bigger, not equal, but only bigger than 0. And I want to do an if branch check on that one. Now, if that is false, if it can't find the item, I want to do exactly the same thing once more. But in this case, I want to do it for my backpack, because maybe I don't have it in with my player. Maybe I have it in the player's backpack. So from the false, I'm going to run that. And it's going to look pretty much the same way. Now, but if any of these are true, what I can do is then simply remove these items and return that it was successful. So I have an event called server remove item. And this is going to remove that item for me. So I need the one from the loop. So this guy right here. And it's going to go ahead and remove that item for me if it's able to find it, like so. Now after that, I need to go ahead and I need to return. So I need to add a return node, and also I need to connect this second if branch checks true to this one as well, because it found an item. So we want to go ahead and try to remove it. Now my server remove function luckily will do pretty much the same thing once more. It's going to double check to make sure we have the item, and if we do, then it's going to remove. Obviously I could have run some kind of a more direct function which is simply going to remove. It's not going to check because we already checked it, but I'm going to do this one because it's a little bit quicker for the tutorial. Now we're going to output something, and we want to output the success to see if we were successful, and this is going to be a boolean. Now over here, we're going to return true. Since we found something, we removed it, and that's it. We want to return and forget about this function. But on the other hand, when we complete the loop, if we go through the loop and we were not able to find any items, we just simply want to return false, and it's going to work just fine. So we're going to do that instead, like so. So one return over here after we remove item, which is true, and a false one down below on the use resources. So now let's actually try to run this whole thing. We're going to need to run another event over here, which we're going to do in a second. First, let's go to our event graph, and mine is actually in the need action mapping. So my keyboard key E event, which is doing the interact with build. So before I interact with the build, what I'm going to do is use build resources, and I'm going to grab this hit actor that we have over here. So I'm going to do some bit of a rerouting again, like so, and connect the actor so that it knows which one it needs to ask for the build resources, like so. Now, as you noticed, I didn't do any checks over here whether it has the interface or not, because I'm already doing that on the E key event. I do check for the build interface, and if it's true, only then I run this event. And then we can do an if branch check to see if we were able to remove the resource, and if we were, then we can go ahead and interact with the build. But this way, well, we are messing up one of the things, which is actually going ahead and opening the doors or windows. So I will need to do some more checks before this. So one of those is going to be, is build finished? That's what I'm going to check for. So I'm going to go ahead and do an if on this one, and only if it's false, only then we can go ahead and try to remove some of the resources. Otherwise, well, this whole thing is going to fail completely and it's not going to work. Well, there's going to be a lot of errors with that. So we got to make sure that the build is not yet finished, so that only then we would spend the resources. Now, if the build is finished, we can go ahead, ignore this whole thing, and just from this true route, we can directly go and interact with the build, because the build is already going to be finished, and it's going to simply allow us to open the doors, because we are using the same event to open and to basically use the resources for our buildables. So I actually made a tiny mistake in the use build resource function. So that's this guy right here. So first and foremost, if you're using the same inventory as I am, in the bottom return items over here that comes from the backpack component, obviously we need to provide that it is a backpack. So that's the first thing. The next thing is I'm going to move this whole thing back a little bit, because instead of plugging this thing straight in, we actually don't want to do that straight away. We want to break this first, because we want to pass along only amount of 1, because we want to provide 1 item at a time. We don't want to spend all of them at the same time. Otherwise, well, this is going to break basically, because we are only checking if we have more than 0. We're never checking if we have more than it's necessary. We're just simply checking if we have something at all. And if we are checking if we have something at all, then it's probably the best idea to just try with just 1 item at a time. Otherwise, well, the issues might occur. So to fix that, very simple. We just want to make this structure, connect the item. You can connect the amount, or you can just simply ignore it, because the amount, the ammo rather, its ammo isn't going to matter for this one, but the amount does matter, and it's very important in this example right here that we provide only 1 resource at a time. So once we have done this, I'm going to go ahead, do some small rerouting, and this thing can now go into all 3 of these bins. So the remove item, return item, and the return item. So these are basically finding whether we have enough items and then removing that exact same amount that we were actually looking for, kind of. Now at this point we can test this out. Technically, well, we're not going to really we're gonna be spending resources, but we're not gonna be spending the ones that we really, well, we're gonna spend the ones that we need, but it's not gonna get, the buildable is not gonna get informed basically, and we're gonna regardlessly need only 3 attempts. So we'll place those there. Let's pick up something. So I have a backpack over here, some logs. So I have 5 logs. So it should be 1, 2, 3. That's finished. 1, 2, and I cannot put in the 3rd one. So now if I pick up another one, let me drop the backpack. That's no longer needed. We need 1 log, and there we go. Okay, so that works. Now we are removing the resources and all that good stuff. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to pass this information along to the buildable that we have provided this specific item, and we need to remove this item, or at least the amount, from the necessary buildables. So what I'm actually going to do is in our use build resource, in this node right here, I'm going to provide this another output, which is going to be the item that we just removed. So I'm going to pass along my item. So I have the slots structure type, and I'm going to pass that along. So I'm going to use the same reference that I used over here. So basically the same one that we removed, the same one that we were looking for, that's the one that we are going to return on success only. On false, we don't need to return anything, but on success. Now, back over here where we actually launched this thing, now we need to pass this along to the interact with build. So go ahead and double click this interface, and it's going to open this function. So just click on it and go ahead and provide this an input and call this, let's call this item. Let's stick with the name item. So that's my slot structure type. And compile, save. Let's close this interface down and let's just connect this like so. Here we go. So that's good. And now we need to actually go, that's the last part. So we are done with all of this. Now we got to provide these functions and information inside of our actual buildable. So I'm going to start off with the build master. And let's go to the event graph. And now on interaction, there you go. As you can see, we are passing along this item variable. Now let's see, I'm going to move this out just for a little bit of a clearance so that we can understand what's actually going on. So what we have over here now is that, well, we are checking whether the build is finished, and if it's not, we are adding like +1 to this integer, and then when it meets the same amount that we provided by default, which is 3, then it just simply gives the collision back and resets the materials back to the original ones, so technically finishes the build. Now we gotta do some different checks. These ones ain't gonna cut it. We don't want to use integers, we want to use our items instead. So for this one, what I'm gonna do is actually make a function so that there's less things in the event graph. So let's call this add resource. There we go. We have the add resource. This needs a single input, which is the item. So we need the slots structure on this one. So our item that we are passing along. And then in the event graph, that can be the very first thing that we do on the interact, or rather actually not the first one. That should be the second one rather, because we are here again checking whether the build is finished. Now, if it's not finished, then we can go ahead and try to add a resource. So let's do that after the first branch check, like so. Now, what we can do next is actually go ahead and completely remove these nodes. We can get those out of the equation for good. So I'm going to disconnect those. For now, I'm going to leave them be. And also, I'm going to go ahead and add this function and output, which is going to be called success. And this is going to be a Boolean. So whether we succeeded to actually add a resource, and that's going to go inside of this branch check right there. So we can go ahead and delete these now. Good. So let's go back to this add resource and let's actually set this up so that it does return us some kind of a value and some kind of an information, because as of right now this is false, so it's always going to fail. So the first thing that we want to do is grab our buildable information. So the information that we have about this specific buildable, we want to break its information so that we get all the items that are necessary for this build to be finished. From there, we can go ahead and do a loop for each with a break, like so. Here we go. And then we want to go ahead and break this item array. I'm going to split the item. And also I'm going to right click and I'm going to get the item. So I'm going to get the item from the input. So this guy right here. Then we can drag from it and break that one as well. And go ahead and split this item as well. So now we have the information about the item that is needed and also the item that we are providing. So we want to check if these two are equal. So the row names for both of those items are equal. So whether that is the same item. Then we can do an if branch check and connect it like so. Now after this, well, we're going to need to have a local variable. So let's call this local found. So whether we found the necessary item, and on true, we want to go ahead and connect that. Also, we want to go ahead and add another variable and call this local index so that we know which index in the items array we are, which is the correct one essentially. So we can make that into an integer and set that one up as well. Now for the values, the local found obviously needs to be true since we were able to find this value, and the local integer is the integer from the array that we ran from the necessary items at the very beginning. So I'm going to do some tiny bit of a reroute. Here we go. Looks good to me. Now after this branch, after this set node, after this local index set, we can go ahead and break this loop so that we are done with it. So again, nice little bit of a reroute. There we go. And once this loop is completed, from the completion, we can go ahead and do a if branch check. Now, the next thing would be to check our local found to see if it was successful. Now, if it's false, we want to go ahead and return false. Technically, this should never happen because we are already checking a lot of things beforehand. But just to be safe, it's always better to just add a couple of checks just in case. But technically, at this point, it should always be fine and there shouldn't be any issues whatsoever. Now on the true route, well, first we need to go ahead and store our items in a local variable so that we can go ahead and modify this and then reset the information about what items are still needed. So first I'm going to go ahead and grab our buildables. Then we are going to go ahead and break this and promote the items to a local variable. And I'm going to call this local items, like so. So we're going to go ahead and set that, and that's going to be the first task that we are going to do. So now we are going to be able to modify this and then reset it back. From there, the next thing would be to actually going ahead and removing the item that we just used. So we can go ahead, get our local items, and from this we can get a copy to the index that we found previously up here above inside of our array. Now this thing right here should be equal to this one right here, so the IDs and the indexes should match up. So I'm going to go ahead and break this like so, and the next thing that we need to do is grab the item that we passed along so that we can actually remove the necessary amount. So we're going to grab our we're going to right click and get the item. So this is the item from the input, and then we can go ahead and break that one as well. Now the next thing would be to go ahead and grab the amount that we have currently and do a minus, and we can remove the amount that we passed along. Now obviously we at some point will gonna run out of the necessary items and they're gonna be equal to 0. So I'm gonna go ahead and check that if it is equal to 0. So then once we have set the local items, stored them in our local variable, we're going to go ahead and check if we remove the provided item, whether then we have used basically all the resources necessary. Now in this case, if it is true, that means that we no longer need, let's say, like those logs, so we can just grab our local items, and from this we can just remove the index completely so that that item is completely gone from the necessary resources. And then for that we can use our local index like so, and we are good with the true route. Now if it's false, that means, well, we still have some items that are necessary. They're not all been used just yet. So again, let's grab our local items, and instead of removing the index completely, we are gonna modify this. So we're gonna set array element like so. There we go. Index, again, the same index, the local one, the local index that we found previously up here above. And for the item, we're going to go ahead and make this structure because we still want to reuse whatever items that we had previously. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy these nodes so that we get the same item. And I'm going to reconnect the ammo as well, even though ammo shouldn't matter. But for the amount, we want to use this amount. So the current necessary resources minus the amount of what we provided and used already. So it's going to look something like this. There we go. Now, optionally, of course, you could have moved this down, but then you're going to have overlapping pins. So I just decided to just copy and paste this part. So we are good with this one. Now we need to go ahead and reset the buildables variable back to using the new necessary items because some of them just got removed. So we're going to go ahead and set our buildables. And we're going to do this from both of these routes. So I'm just going to double click this route execution so that I create a reroute, and it's going to look something like this for me. Now I'm going to drag from this and I'm going to make this structure like so. And also I'm going to go ahead and bring in another buildables variable. This time I'm going to get it. I'm going to break this so that we can repopulate all the other parameters like the mesh, trace channel, actor, resources. Well, that's going to be gone in a second, but all of them except for the items, because for the items now we can go ahead and use our local items array that we just modified, and that's going to contain all the new information about what resources are still necessary. There we go. Now the last thing would be to just simply return, but when we return, obviously we need to make sure if we are done with the build or not, and we can find that out by grabbing our local items and then dragging from this. We can say length, and this is going to return us how many elements in the array there are left, and we want to check whether this is equal to 0. And this is, if it's going to be 0, it's going to return us true. That means that we have used all the necessary resources in order to finish this build. So then we can go ahead and compile and save this, and we should be nearly good to go, except for we need to connect the item value inside of our child buildables. So for instance, let's start with the build foundation. As you can see, we have our interact with build, and then we have the parents interact with build. We got to make sure that we connect these two together. That's very important. Go through all of your buildables and check for that. Now in the foundation, we don't have, in the floor, we don't have those. We have them in some of our buildables, which have some additional tasks that need to be made when we are interacting with them. So that's not going to happen in the floor. There's no additional tasks. In the door, there is one. As you can see, there is a task, so we can go ahead and plug that one in. And then let's have a look what else we got. We have the build house, doesn't have it. Build wall, doesn't have it. And we have the build window, for which we actually need to recreate the functionality we just did, because this one doesn't use the build master. So let's just close all of these off except for the build master and the build window. And let's just start copying things. So we have this guy right here, which is going to be our first task. And then let's see, we need to remove this bit. So we can go ahead and get rid of that one, except for the branch check. The branch check can stay. But here we need this other function, which is called add resources. So I'm going to go ahead and select this function. I'm going to copy this. Go to the window and just anywhere Control V, and it's going to paste this function in for me. Now it's going to break some of the things, like this thing isn't going to be working, so we need to delete that, and we need to re-get the item. That's the one from the input, so we got to plug that one in. Just going to go ahead and copy this because we have another one over here. There we go, and everything else should be fine. It should copy and paste the local variables as well, and all the other variables should be called the same way. So now back in our event graph, in our build window, we can go ahead and run this add resources from this false route, plug in the item, and then let me actually bring this a little closer. Go ahead and connect the execution to the branch and the condition to the branch as well. There we go. So let's give it a try. Let's see whether we actually have succeeded. So we have the foundation, we have the window. There we go. So let's try testing this out. So if we press E, as you can see, it removed one log, it removed another log, removed all the planks, and there we go. So as you can see, it instantly starts telling us, showing the updated information about that the resource has been used. So now it requires 4, 3, 2, 1. There we go. So yeah, that's going to be it for today's video. Now we were able to actually start using the resources to finish these buildables, and now it's going to be time to start replicating this whole thing. So if you found this useful and you are still following this series, make sure to leave a like. That will help the algorithm quite a bit. And yeah, thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.